He invited his poor ex-wife to his luxury wedding just to watch her shrink under crystal chandeliers and champagne laughter, but Emily Carter didn't flinch even when his bride smirked and the guests whispered about her cheap dress, because she kept checking the time, and then it happened. Engines roared outside, 10 black SUVs lined up like a silent army, the doors opened one by one, and a man stepped out, calm, powerful, untouchable. The room froze as he walked straight past everyone and stopped in front of her, lowering his voice, "I'm sorry I'm late." And that's when Ryan realized the wedding was never his moment, it was hers. He didn't invite her to celebrate, he invited her to disappear. And as Emily Carter stood at the entrance of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom, she felt it immediately, the weight of 1,000 silent judgments pressing against her skin. Like cold glass, the air smelled of champagne and expensive perfume, the golden chandeliers above casting a soft glow over diamond necklaces and tailored tuxedos. A world she once belonged to and was now clearly unwelcome in. Her heels clicked softly against polished marble, each step measured, each breath controlled. She could feel eyes turning, whispers rising just loud enough to sting. "That's her, isn't it? Ryan's ex, the one who lost everything." Someone let out a quiet laugh. Another voice murmured, "Poor thing, she looks exactly how you'd expect." Emily didn't react. She adjusted the simple navy dress at her waist, a dress chosen not to impress but to disappear. And yet she didn't look down, she didn't rush, she moved through the crowd with a quiet steadiness that felt almost out of place in a room built on performance. At the center of it all stood Ryan Whitmore, flawless, in a custom tuxedo, a glass of champagne in his hand, his smile sharp and polished. Beside him, Sophia Blake, radiant in white, her laughter light and practiced, her fingers resting possessively on his arm, as if claiming a victory everyone in the room already accepted. When Ryan finally noticed Emily, his expression didn't change, not at first, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of satisfaction, as if the night had just begun to go exactly as planned. "Emily Carter," he said, stepping forward, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention, "I wasn't sure you'd come." A few guests turned fully now, the room subtly shifting its focus toward her. Sophia's gaze followed, cool and assessing. "Oh, this must be the ex," she said with a soft smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've heard so much about you." "Not all of it." Kinda surrounding laughter was polite, restrained, but sharp enough to cut. Ryan lifted his glass slightly. "You look comfortable." Emily, the word landed exactly how he intended. Comfortable, meaning small, meaning forgotten, meaning nothing. Emily met his eyes for a brief second, and in that moment something inside her didn't break, it settled like a storm, choosing its timing. She gave a small polite nod. "Thank you, Ryan, congratulations." Her voice was calm, almost distant, as if she were speaking from somewhere far away. Not a trace of the woman he used to control, not a hint of the humiliation he expected. Sophia tilted her head, studying her with mild amusement. "I suppose it takes courage to show up like this," she said lightly, "or maybe you just didn't have anything better to do." Another ripple of quiet laughter. Emily didn't answer. She glanced briefly at the towering windows beyond the ballroom, where the night stretched dark and still, then almost unconsciously her wrist turned, her eyes flicking to the time, a small gesture easily missed, but not entirely unnoticed. Ryan's smile tightened just slightly, as if something about her composure unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The music swelled, a slow, elegant melody filling the space. Glasses clinked. Conversations resumed, but the tension lingered like static in the air. Emily stood there alone in a room designed to remind her of everything she had lost, and yet her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged, as if she wasn't waiting to be judged, she was waiting for something else entirely. And somewhere far beyond the golden lights and polished marble, the faintest echo of distant engines began to hum. The music continued to glide through the ballroom, smooth and elegant, as if nothing had shifted, yet something had. Every laugh sounded a little sharper, every glance lingered a little longer. Emily could feel it, the subtle change in the air, like pressure building before a storm. She stepped further inside the room, her fingers brushing lightly against the stem of a champagne glass. She had no intention of drinking. The scent of citrus and polished marble surrounded her, familiar once, comforting, now distant like a memory. She no longer belonged to Ryan. Watched her from across the room, his smile returning for the benefit of his guests, but his eyes no longer left her. It bothered him more than he expected, the way she stood there, not defensive, not apologetic, just present, as if she had every right to be there. Sophia leaned closer to him, her voice low and amused. "She is not reacting the way you said she would." Ryan let Out a quiet breath, he replied, though the certainty in his voice felt thinner than before. He set his glass down and walked toward the center of the ballroom, drawing attention with ease, the kind of presence built from years of being admired. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out, lifting his voice just enough to gather the room. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate something truly special. The guests turned toward him, glasses raised, smiles ready. The performance resumed perfectly. Timed. Sophia moved to his side, radiant and poised, the image of everything he wanted the world to see. Ryan continued, speaking, his tone warm, confident. Control tonight is about new beginnings, about leaving the past behind and stepping into something better, stronger, more aligned with who we are meant to be. A few guests nodded approvingly, others clinked glasses softly, but as his words echoed, Emily felt something else, not pain, not regret, just a quiet recognition of how carefully he still curated his reality. She remembered the way he used to speak like this at charity galas, at private dinners, always crafting a version of truth that placed him at the center of admiration, always adjusting the narrative until it fit his ambition. There had been a time when she believed every word, when she had stood beside him, smiling, supporting, becoming smaller so he could feel bigger. She remembered the apartment overlooking the river, the floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected a life built on appearances. The nights she waited alone while he chased deals that never quite made sense, the subtle corrections in his tone when she spoke too freely, the way he called her emotional whenever she questioned him. And then the day everything collapsed, the headlines, the investigations, the quiet meetings behind closed doors where decisions were made without her, where her name became a liability, something to be erased. She had walked away with nothing but silence and a version of herself she barely recognized. Yet standing here, now she did not feel that emptiness anymore. Ryan raised his glass higher, his voice sharpening slightly, as if preparing for something more pointed, and sometimes he added with a faint smile, we outgrow what no longer fits us. A few people chuckled lightly, understanding exactly who he meant. Emily met his gaze across the room just for a second, and in that brief moment, there was no anger, no pleading, no trace of the woman he had once dismissed, only stillness, and that unsettled him more than anything. Sophia noticed it too, the way his expression flickered just slightly before he recovered. She followed his line of sight, her eyes narrowing as she studied Emily more carefully now, as if trying to understand what had changed. Emily did not move, she did not speak, but once again her eyes shifted toward the entrance, toward the towering glass doors that separated the glowing ballroom from the dark, quiet night outside. And this time the sound was clearer, engines low and synchronized, growing louder with each passing second, the faint vibration beneath the marble floor barely noticeable to most, but impossible to ignore if you were listening closely enough. And Emily Carter was listening. The sound did not belong to the music or the laughter or the carefully rehearsed rhythm of the evening. It was deeper, heavier, deliberate, a low, synchronized hum that rolled through the night outside the glass walls. And for a brief moment, it felt like the entire ballroom paused without understanding why. A few guests near the entrance turned their heads first, their brows tightening slightly as the headlights cut across the driveway in long, sharp beams of white. One car, then another, until 10 black vehicles lined up with quiet precision, their engines idling like a controlled force waiting to be acknowledged. The valet staff froze mid-step. The event coordinator near the entrance instinctively straightened, his posture, confusion flickering across his face, because this was not part of the schedule. This was not something he had approved. Inside the ballroom, the music faltered, just slightly, not enough to stop, but enough to be noticed by those paying attention, and Ryan noticed his speech slowed, his words trailing off as his eyes shifted toward the doors. His confidence held for a second longer before something unfamiliar crept in, uncertainty. Sophia followed his gaze, her fingers tightening just slightly around his arm. What is that? She whispered, but he did not answer, because for the first time that evening, he did not have control over what was happening. The doors at the entrance opened smoothly, as if guided by an unseen cue, and a ripple moved through the crowd. Conversations softened, heels paused against marble, and every eye began to turn toward the source of interruption. Emily did not move. She did not turn immediately. She simply exhaled slowly, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. Then she looked toward the entrance, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, inevitable. One of the drivers stepped out, first moving with quiet efficiency, opening the rear door of the central vehicle, and then he appeared, a man stepping into the light. With a presence that did not need introduction, his suit was tailored perfectly dark and precise, his movements unhurried, his gaze steady, as he took in the scene, not with curiosity, but with quiet authority, the kind that came from knowing exactly where he stood in any room. He entered, a subtle shift passed through the staff, near the entrance, recognition perhaps, or something close to it. The event manager moved quickly now as earlier. Confusion replaced with sudden attentiveness, as if a silent hierarchy had just been rearranged. The man did not acknowledge the crowd. He did not glance at the decorations or the spectacle built around him. Instead, he walked forward, his footsteps measured against the marble floor, each one drawing more attention than the last. Whispers began to spread quietly at first, then building. Who is that? Is that Alexander Hayes? The name moved like electricity through the room, soft but powerful enough to change the atmosphere entirely. Ryan felt it, the shift slipping beneath his feet, the certainty he had carried all night thinning with every step that man took closer. Sophia straightened, her posture, her expression tightening, her confidence now edged with something sharper, something uncertain, because this was not a variable she had calculated. And then the man stopped, not at the center, not beside Ryan, not near the stage, but directly in front of Emily Carter, the distance between them closing with quiet inevitability. The room held its breath. He looked at her, not as someone unexpected, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as if she had always been the destination of his arrival. His voice, when it came, was low, controlled, unmistakably certain. I apologize for being late, Emily. And in that single sentence, the balance of the entire room shifted, because it was not an introduction, it was recognition, and for the first time that night, Emily Carter was no longer the woman they had come to watch fade into the background. She was the one. Everything had just begun to revolve around. The silence that followed his words was not empty. It was heavy, layered with realization, spreading from one corner of the ballroom to the other like a slow-moving wave. Every gaze locked onto Emily, now not with pity, not with quiet judgment, but with something else, something sharper, curiosity mixed with disbelief. Alexander Hayes stood before her, as if the entire room did not exist, his posture relaxed, yet commanding, his presence rewriting the atmosphere without effort. Emily met his eyes, and for the first time that evening a subtle change touched her expression, not surprise, not relief, but recognition, as if this moment had always been certain. You made it, she said softly, her voice steady, the faintest hint of warmth beneath its calm surface. Alexander inclined his head slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. Of course I would, he replied, as though there had never been another possibility behind them. The staff had fully shifted now. The event manager, who earlier had moved with routine authority, now hovered, uncertain, attentive, waiting for a signal that was not coming from Ryan anymore. A senior hotel executive appeared near the entrance, almost out of nowhere, his suit immaculate, his expression alert. He approached carefully, his voice lowered with respect. Mr. Hayes, we were not informed of your arrival. The title alone rippled through the room, confirming what whispers had already begun to form. Ryan felt it settle into place, the name, the recognition, the hierarchy rearranging itself in real time. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass, the faint sound of crystal under pressure almost lost beneath the growing tension. Sophia straightened beside him, her practiced smile faltering just enough to reveal the crack beneath her composure. She leaned closer to Ryan, her voice tight. Who is he? But Ryan did not answer, because now he knew, and knowing did not bring control, only deepened the unease. Alexander finally shifted his attention, not fully, not dismissively, but just enough to acknowledge the space around him. His gaze passed briefly over the guests, the decorations, the orchestrated luxury of the evening, and in that glance something subtle changed. The room that moments ago had belonged entirely to Ryan now felt smaller, almost staged, as if it were a performance being quietly evaluated. The executive stepped aside, instinctively, giving him space, as if the authority he carried required no announcement. Emily remained still beside him, her presence no longer blending into the background, but anchoring the center of the moment. Ryan forced himself to move, stepping forward, his expression carefully reconstructed, his smile returning, though it no longer held the same effortless confidence. Alexander Hayes, he said, extending his hand with practiced ease, I did not realize you would be attending this evening. Alexander looked at the offered hand for a brief second, not dismissing it, but not rushing to meet it either. The pause stretched just long enough to shift the balance again before he accepted it with a firm, measured grip. I am not attending, he said calmly, his voice even but unmistakably precise. I am here for her. And with that simple sentence. The final illusion of control fractured, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Sophia inhaled sharply beside Ryan, her eyes moving between them as understanding began to take shape, not fully formed, but enough to unsettle everything she had believed about this night. Emily glanced once more at the room, the chandeliers, the polished marble, the carefully curated elegance, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something in her gaze, not triumph, not pride, but quiet certainty, as if the stage had finally aligned with the truth that had always existed beneath it all. And somewhere deep within the shifting silence, Ryan Whitmore realized that whatever he had planned for this night had already slipped beyond his reach. The room did not recover, it only adjusted, shifting its weight toward a truth no one had expected to witness. The music had stopped entirely, now the silence no longer subtle, but absolute. Every movement, every breath felt amplified beneath the crystal chandeliers, as if the entire evening had been paused mid-performance. Emily could feel it in the way the air settled around her, no longer pressing down, but opening, clearing space. Where she had once been pushed to the edges, Alexander remained beside her, not shielding, not dominating, simply present, and that presence alone was enough to redraw every invisible line in the room. The hotel executive, who had approached moments earlier, now stood a respectful distance away, his posture straight, his attention fixed not on Ryan, not on the bride, but on Emily, waiting as though her next word mattered more than the entire event. Ryan forced a small laugh, attempting to reclaim anything of the control he had built this night upon. "Well," he said lightly, glancing between them, "I did not realize you two were acquainted." The word acquainted felt fragile as soon as it left his mouth, as though it could not carry the weight of what was unfolding. Alexander did not respond immediately. His gaze shifted to Emily, just for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement, a permission, perhaps, before returning to Ryan. "We are more than acquainted," he said simply, his tone calm, but precise enough to cut through any attempt at minimization. Sophia stepped forward, then her composure carefully rebuilt, though her eyes still betrayed the tension beneath. "I think there must be some misunderstanding," she said with a polite smile. "This is a private event." Her voice was measured, but there was an edge, now something sharper beneath the surface. Alexander regarded her briefly, not dismissively, but without any need to engage directly, the kind of glance that recognized her presence without granting it influence. The hotel executive cleared his throat quietly, as if sensing the shift and needing to correct the narrative before it settled incorrectly. "Miss Blake," he said carefully, "this property is not entirely private." The statement hung in the air, unfinished, but heavy with implication. Ryan's expression tightened. "What do you mean, not entirely private?" he asked, the confidence in his voice now strained just enough to be noticed. The executive hesitated only for a moment before continuing. "As of last quarter, the majority ownership of this hotel group was transferred under new management." The words were formal, controlled, but their effect was immediate. A ripple of shock moved through the guests, subtle but undeniable. Sophia's smile faltered completely, now her hand dropping from Ryan's arm as she tried to process what she was hearing. Ryan stared at the executive, as if waiting for him to correct himself, to laugh, to retract the statement. But no such correction came. Instead, the executive turned slightly toward Emily, his posture shifting once more. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully, "would you like us to proceed as scheduled, or make any adjustments to the event?" And in that moment, the final piece fell into place, not announced, not declared, but understood. Emily Carter was no longer a guest in this room. She was the one who defined it. Emily let the silence stretch just a second longer, her eyes moving slowly across the ballroom, taking in the faces, the whispers, the disbelief that had replaced the earlier condescension. She did not smile, she did not gloat, she simply breathed in the space that had once rejected her, and now waited for her decision. "No," she said softly, her voice steady, clear. "Let them continue." Her gaze returned to Ryan, calm, unwavering. "Enjoy your wedding," she added quietly, the faintest pause before her final words, "while it still belongs to you." And just like that, the balance of power did not shift, it settled, leaving Ryan standing in the center of a celebration that no longer felt like his own. The words did not echo, they settled, sinking into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. "Enjoy your wedding while it still belongs to you." The sentence lingered heavier than any insult ever could, because it was not meant to wound, it was meant to define. And as the silence stretched, the guests began to shift, not physically, not yet, but internally, their expressions changing, recalculating, reassessing. The woman they had dismissed only moments ago. Emily did not wait for a reaction. She did not need one. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting past Ryan, past Sophia, past the carefully constructed image of a perfect beginning, and toward the vast glass windows where the night waited still and unbothered. Alexander remained beside her, his presence unchanged, as if nothing about this moment surprised him, as if this outcome had always been inevitable. Ryan tried to recover. He straightened his posture, forcing a breath through lungs that suddenly felt tighter than before. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice sharper now, less polished. "We are in the middle of an event." He gestured vaguely around the room, as if the decorations, the guests, the spectacle itself, could restore his authority. "You cannot just walk in here and disrupt everything." The statement hung there fragile, lacking the certainty it once would have carried, because even as he spoke he could feel the shift, the subtle but undeniable way the room no longer responded to him, the way the staff remained still, awaiting Emily, not him, the way the guests watched, not with admiration, but with curiosity. Sophia stepped forward again, her composure strained, but determined. "This is inappropriate," she added, her tone controlled, though her eyes flickered briefly toward the hotel executive, as if seeking confirmation that she still held some place in the hierarchy. Alexander turned his head slightly, then his gaze settling on Ryan with a calm that was almost disarming. "I did not disrupt anything," he said quietly. "I arrived when I was expected." The words were simple, but their implication spread quickly through the room. Expected by whom? The answer did not need to be spoken, it was already understood. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come immediately. Something unfamiliar holding him back, the realization that every sentence he chose now would only confirm what was already unraveling. Emily watched him for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a distant clarity, as if she were observing a version of her past finally catching up to the present. She remembered the countless times she had stood in rooms like this, smaller, quieter, waiting for his approval, shaping herself into something more acceptable, more polished, more aligned with his world. And now, standing here, she felt none of that pull, no need to explain, no need to defend, only a quiet separation from everything he once defined as important. She took a slow breath, the scent of champagne still lingering in the air, but no longer overwhelming, and turned back to Alexander. "We should not stay long," she said softly, her voice even. He studied her for a brief second, then nodded once, a simple agreement that carried no hesitation. As they began to move, the room parted, not dramatically, not with intention, but naturally, as if space itself adjusted to allow it, a path forming where none had existed before. Ryan watched them go, the realization settling deeper with each step. This night had been designed to remind her of what she lost, but instead it had revealed what he no longer controlled. Sophia stood beside him, silent now, her earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something uncertain. As the music slowly resumed, hesitant at first, then steadier, as if attempting to restore normalcy, the illusion of celebration returned, but it no longer held the same weight, because at the center of it all something had shifted permanently. And as Emily Carter walked toward the exit beside a man who did not need to prove his power, the truth became undeniable. She had not come back to reclaim anything, she had come back to show that she had already moved beyond it. The cool night air met her before the doors fully opened, carrying with it a quiet stillness that felt entirely different from the heavy atmosphere she had just left behind. Emily stepped outside, the soft sound of her heels against stone echoing faintly in the open space as the line of black vehicles stood waiting, their engines now silent, as if they had already served their purpose. The city stretched beyond the driveway, distant lights flickering like something calm and permanent, untouched by the tension she had just walked away from. For a moment, she paused, not out of hesitation, but to breathe, to let the shift settle fully into her chest. Alexander stopped beside her, his presence steady but unobtrusive, giving her the space he understood she needed without ever stepping away. "You handled that exactly as you intended," he said quietly, his tone not congratulatory, not surprised, simply observant. Emily exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed ahead. "I did not come to prove anything," she replied, her voice calm. "I just needed to see it clearly." He studied her for a second longer, the faintest nod following, as if her answer confirmed something he had already known. Behind them, through the tall glass windows, the ballroom still glowed with gold light, figures moving inside, music returning in careful waves, as if nothing had happened. Yet even from here the change was visible. The energy altered, the illusion thinner. Ryan stood near the center, still speaking, still attempting to hold the structure together, but his movements were sharper. Now less fluid. Sophia remained at his side, though her posture no longer carried the same effortless confidence, her attention drifting again and again toward the exit, as if the presence that had just left continued to occupy the room more than those who remained in it. Emily followed that distant image for only a second before turning away completely. Whatever connection she had to that world no longer pulled at her, not even slightly. A memory at most, nothing more. A driver stepped forward, opening the rear door of one of the vehicles with quiet precision, the interior lit softly, warm, controlled. Ready? Alexander gestured subtly. After you, he said, and she moved without hesitation, slipping into the seat, the leather cool beneath her fingertips, the faint scent of clean linen replacing the perfume and champagne she had left behind. He followed, taking his place beside her, the door closing with a soft final click, sealing them into a space untouched by everything outside. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence, comfortable, grounded, the kind that did not need to be filled. The car began to move smoothly, pulling away from the entrance, the line of vehicles following in silent coordination as the hotel faded gradually behind them. Emily glanced once more through the window, the golden lights growing smaller, the figures inside dissolving into distance until they were no longer distinguishable, just another scene in a life she had already outgrown. Alexander watched her carefully, not intruding, simply present. What changed? He asked after a moment, his voice low. She considered the question, not rushing to answer, not searching for the right words, only letting the truth surface on its own. Nothing changed, she said finally. I just stopped seeing it the way he wanted me to. And as the car turned onto the main road, the city opening up before them wide and endless, there was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt, no trace of the woman who once stood in that ballroom, trying to belong, only clarity, quiet and complete. And somewhere behind them, in a room still filled with light and music, Ryan Whitmore remained surrounded by everything he had built, and for the first time, it was no longer enough. The city unfolded outside the window in long, quiet stretches of light and shadow, street lamps passing in steady intervals as the car moved smoothly through the night. Emily sat back against the seat, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the tension that had once lived in her shoulders no longer there, only a calm stillness that felt earned rather than given. Alexander remained beside her, not watching the road, not checking his phone, simply present, his attention resting in the space between them, as if he understood that silence was part of the moment, not an absence of it. The hum of the engine was low, almost soothing, the kind of sound that filled the background without demanding anything from it. After a while, the convoy slowed the cars ahead, signaling softly as they turned into a wide private drive lined with tall trees, their branches casting long shadows across the pavement. The gates opened before they even came to a full stop, seamless, automatic, the kind of access that did not require permission because it had already been granted. The estate beyond revealed itself gradually, a modern structure of glass and stone set against the dark hillside, its lights warm but controlled, not excessive, not performative, just precise. The car came to a gentle stop, and the driver stepped out immediately, opening her door. Emily paused for a fraction of a second, taking in the quiet, the difference between this place and the ballroom she had just left behind. There was no noise here, no expectation, no audience, just space. Alexander stepped out after her, his gaze briefly scanning the surroundings before returning to her. This is where you wanted to come, he said. It was not a question. Emily nodded once, a small confirmation, her eyes moving across the property, not with wonder, but with familiarity. This had not been built for display, it had been built for clarity, for control, for a life that did not depend on anyone else's approval. She walked forward slowly, the stone beneath her feet cool and solid, each step grounding her further in a reality she had chosen, not one that had been shaped for her. Alexander followed at a comfortable distance, not leading, not directing, only there when needed. Inside the house, the air was quiet, the scent of cedar and clean linen replacing the artificial polish of the ballroom's soft lighting traced the lines of the architecture, nothing sharp, nothing overwhelming, everything intentional. Emily moved through the space without hesitation, as if she had walked these paths 100 times before. She stopped near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city below, the view expansive but distant, the same city where Ryan still stood, surrounded by noise and illusion. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, not to hold on, But to feel the separation, Alexander approached, then stopping beside her, his reflection faintly visible in the window. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice low. She did not answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the lights blurred into something indistinct, something that no longer defined her. After a moment, she spoke, not turning to him, not needing to. "This was never about tonight," she said quietly. "It was about understanding that I do not belong to that version of my life anymore." The words settled between them, simple but complete. Alexander studied her profile for a second, then gave a small nod as if acknowledging a decision that had already been made long before this evening. The silence returned, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of everything that had shifted, everything that had been left behind. And as the city continued to move far below them, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place, Emily Carter stood in a space that was entirely her own, no longer looking back, not because she could not, but because there was nothing left there worth returning to. The night settled deeper around the house, wrapping the glass walls in a quiet darkness that felt almost protective. Inside, the stillness remained uninterrupted. No music, no distant laughter, no shifting expectations, only the faint hum of the city far below, like something distant and irrelevant. Emily stood by the window a moment longer, her reflection faint against the glass, no longer searching, no longer questioning, just present. Behind her, Alexander moved quietly across the room, setting his phone aside on a low marble table. The subtle sound barely noticeable. He had already handled everything that needed to be handled before they arrived. There were no urgent messages, no disruptions, no loose ends. This was not a life built on reaction. It was built on preparation, and Emily knew that without asking. "You do not have to stay here tonight," he said after a while, his voice low enough to match the stillness. She turned slightly, her gaze shifting from the window to him, not surprised by the offer, only acknowledging it. "I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go," she replied calmly. "I am staying because this is where I chose to be." The distinction was quiet, but absolute. Alexander studied her for a brief moment, then nodded, once accepting it without question. There was no need to push, no need to define anything further. Everything between them existed without pressure, without expectation, built on something steadier than what she had left behind. Emily walked slowly across the room, her fingers brushing lightly along the edge of a console table, the smooth surface cool beneath her touch, each step deliberate, each movement grounded. She stopped near a framed architectural plan mounted on the wall, lines clean, precise, the blueprint of something that had been designed long before it was ever seen. She looked at it for a moment, her eyes tracing the structure, the intent behind every detail. "You built this before everything fell apart," she said, not turning. Alexander stepped closer, his gaze following hers. "Not before," he corrected quietly. "I built it because I knew something would." She glanced at him, then the faintest shift in her expression, not surprise, but understanding, as if another piece had just aligned into place. He had not been waiting for her to fail, he had been preparing for when she would no longer accept what was breaking her. The realization settled gently, not overwhelming, not heavy, just clear. Outside the glass, the city continued moving, unaware of the quiet clarity unfolding above it, the lights flickering like distant signals of a world still chasing something, still trying to prove something. Emily turned back toward the window. Once more, her posture relaxed, her breathing. "Even I used to think losing everything meant starting over," she said softly. "Now I understand. It just meant removing what was never mine to begin with." The words lingered in the air, simple but complete. Alexander did not respond immediately. He did not need to. The truth in what she said did not require affirmation, only recognition. After a moment, he stepped beside her again, his presence steady but unobtrusive. "And now?" he asked quietly. She looked out over the city, her gaze no longer searching for answers, only observing what was already certain. "Now," she said, "I build something that does not disappear when someone else decides I am not enough." The sentence settled with a quiet strength, the kind that did not need to be declared loudly to be undeniable. And somewhere far across the city, beneath lights that suddenly felt harsher than before, Ryan Whitmore stood in a room that was beginning to feel unfamiliar, surrounded by everything he once believed defined success. And for the first time, the absence of one person made all of it feel incomplete. Morning arrived slowly, the kind of quiet light that did not demand attention, but filled the space gently as if it had always belonged there. The glass walls softened the sunrise into a muted glow stretching across the stone floors and clean lines of the room. Emily stood in the kitchen barefoot, a cup of coffee warming her hands, the rich scent grounding her in a way that felt unfamiliar, yet steady. She had slept without interruption, without the restless weight that used to follow her even into silence, and now standing here, she felt something she had not felt in years, clarity, not as a sudden realization, but as something that had been building quietly, finally settling into place. Behind her the house remained still, no hurried footsteps, no ringing phones, no urgency, just space. Alexander entered a few moments later, his presence as calm as the morning itself, his sleeves rolled slightly, his expression composed. As always. You are up early, he said, not surprised, just observant. Emily gave a small nod. I used to wake up like this, she replied, before everything became about keeping up. The words were simple, but carried a history. She did not need to explain. He understood without asking. He moved to the counter, pouring his own coffee. The sound, soft, controlled, the kind of routine that did not disrupt the quiet outside. The city stretched beneath them, waking slowly, traffic beginning to trace thin lines of movement across distant streets, life continuing, unaware of the shift that had taken place above it. Emily stepped closer to the window again, her gaze following the horizon, not searching, just observing. Last night feels distant already, she said softly, as if it belongs to someone else. Alexander leaned lightly against the counter, watching her, not with curiosity, but with recognition. That is because it does, he replied. The answer came without hesitation, without the need to soften it. Emily considered that for a moment, her reflection faint against the glass, the version of herself she had carried for years, the one shaped by expectation and compromise, no longer visible in the same way. I thought closure would feel louder, she admitted, something more final. He shook his head slightly. Not everything ends with a sound, some things just stop holding you. The simplicity of it settled deeper than anything else she had heard that night. She turned from the window, then setting the cup down, her movements unhurried. There was no rush, no pressure to define what came next, only the understanding that it was hers to shape. A quiet notification appeared on the tablet resting on the counter, the screen lighting briefly before dimming again. Alexander glanced at it, but did not reach for it, not yet. Emily noticed the brief flicker of light and looked at him. You already knew this would happen, she said, not as a question, but as a realization. He did not deny it. I knew he would underestimate you, he replied calmly, and I knew you would not stay where you were no longer valued. She absorbed that in silence, not as praise, not as validation, but as confirmation of something she had already begun to understand about herself. The room remained quiet, the morning steady, the kind of stillness that did not need to be filled, and as the sunlight grew stronger, casting longer reflections across the glass, Emily Carter stood in a space that no longer echoed with someone else's expectations, only her own direction beginning to take shape, and far across the city, in a room that had once felt like the center of everything, Ryan Whitmore was waking up to a reality that no longer included her in any way that he could control. By midday, the stillness of the house had shifted into something more structured, not disrupted, but activated with quiet precision. Emily stood in the study, a space lined with glass and clean steel surfaces overlooking the city, now fully awake, the distant hum of movement rising faintly through the walls. She rested her fingertips on the edge of a large table where a series of documents had been arranged, not scattered, not rushed, but deliberately placed, as if waiting for her attention. Alexander stood across from her, his posture relaxed but focused. This was not a surprise. This was the continuation of something already in motion. These are the current holdings, he said calmly, his voice, even as he gestured lightly toward the documents. The hotel group is only one part of it. Emily did not sit immediately. She let her gaze move over the papers, absorbing not just the information, but the structure behind it: ownership percentages, acquisition timelines, strategic partnerships, each detail precise, each decision layered with intent. This was not wealth built for display, it was control designed to endure. She pulled out the chair slowly and sat down, her movements unhurried as she reached for the first document, the paper smooth beneath her fingers, the ink sharp and clear. As she read, she felt something shift again, not emotionally, not dramatically, but intellectually, a recognition of scale, of responsibility, of choice. This is not new, she said after a moment, her voice thoughtful. You have been building this for years. Alexander did not deny it. I build what lasts, he replied simply, and I do not wait for the right moment, I prepare for it. Emily glanced up at him, then the faintest understanding passing between them, He had not stepped into her life by chance. He had been moving toward this long before she realized she needed to move at all. Her attention returned to the documents, a section highlighted with subtle precision, drawing her focus. The transfer structure here, she said quietly, it is not just under your name. Alexander shook his head slightly. It never was, he answered. And then, after a brief pause, it is under yours now. The words did not land as a shock. They settled as confirmation, as if something that had already been set into motion had simply reached the point of acknowledgement. Emily's hand stilled for a second on the page. Not hesitation, not disbelief, just the weight of clarity settling fully into place. You trusted me with this, she said. Her voice steady, but lower now. He met her gaze without hesitation. I trusted who you are when you are not being diminished by someone else. The simplicity of it cut deeper than anything else, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Outside the glass, the city continued moving, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside this room. Deals being made, decisions being enforced, systems turning as they always had. But here something had changed. Emily Carter was no longer reacting to the life she had been given. She was shaping what came next. She leaned back slightly, the chair supporting her, as she exhaled slowly, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just aware of the scale of what now existed in front of her. I am not interested in control for the sake of it, she said finally, her voice calm but defined. I am interested in building something that does not collapse when someone decides I am no longer useful. Alexander nodded once, as if that answer had already been expected. Then you will do exactly that, he said, and as the afternoon light shifted across the glass, casting long reflections through the room, Emily looked down at the documents, once more, not as something to inherit, not as something to manage, but as something to define. And far across the city, in a place that once felt like the center of everything, Ryan Whitmore was beginning to understand that what he had dismissed as insignificant had never been small. It had simply been waiting to stand on its own. The afternoon settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that did not rush, but moved with purpose. As Emily stood once again before the glass wall in the study, the documents, now neatly aligned behind her, no longer untouched, but understood. The city below continued its steady motion, unaware of the subtle shift that had already begun to ripple outward from decisions made in silence. Her reflection in the glass no longer carried the uncertainty of the woman who once waited for permission to exist in certain spaces. It was clearer, now defined not by appearance, but by direction. A soft knock broke the stillness, not abrupt, but deliberate. Alexander did not move immediately. He simply glanced toward the door, as if already aware of who stood behind it. Come in, he said calmly. The door opened to reveal the same hotel executive from the previous evening, his posture precise, his expression respectful, but now carrying a different weight, not uncertainty, but recognition. Miss Carter, he said, stepping inside with measured steps. I wanted to follow up regarding the operational transition. There are several matters that require your direct confirmation. Emily turned slightly, facing him fully, her posture relaxed but grounded. The shift in how she was addressed did not surprise her. It simply aligned with what had already been set in motion. What needs to be addressed? She asked, her voice even. The executive stepped closer, placing a tablet on the table, its screen lighting softly, as he navigated through a series of reports: occupancy, restructuring, vendor contracts, event liabilities, all the moving parts of a system that had once operated without her knowledge, now presented clearly within her reach. There is also the matter of last night, he added carefully, the event associated with Mr. Whitmore. There have been inquiries regarding continued usage of the venue. Emily listened without interruption, her gaze steady, as she absorbed not just the information, but the implications beneath it. The wedding that had been designed to diminish her now existed within a structure she controlled entirely. She could end it, restrict it, redefine it with a single instruction. The power was not abstract, it was immediate, tangible. And yet she felt no urgency to use it. The executive waited, his posture still respectful, but attentive, awaiting direction. Alexander remained silent, observing, not guiding, not influencing, allowing the decision to exist entirely within her. Emily took a slow breath, her eyes moving briefly to the city beyond the glass, then back to the screen, the faintest pause stretching just long enough to signal consideration before resolution. No changes, she said finally, her voice calm. Let the event conclude as plan? The executive blinked once, not in confusion, but in brief surprise, as if the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any complex directive understood. He replied immediately, his tone shifting to full confirmation. "I will ensure everything proceeds accordingly." He gathered the tablet, stepping back with a slight nod before exiting the room as quietly as he had entered the door, closing with a soft final sound, leaving the space once again in stillness. Alexander studied her for a moment, not questioning, only acknowledging. "You could have ended it," he said. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I know," she replied. And then, after a brief pause, "I did not need to." The words settled between them, carrying a clarity that did not require further explanation. She had not come back to take something from him. She had come back to stand beyond it. And now there was nothing left to prove. The room remained quiet, the light shifting slowly across the floor as the afternoon moved forward, and in that stillness, Emily Carter understood fully that control was not about what you could take away from someone, it was about what you no longer needed to touch at all. And somewhere across the city, in a ballroom that still shimmered with borrowed light, Ryan Whitmore continued a celebration that no longer held the meaning he believed it did, unaware that the most important decision of the night had already been made without him.